not so different from in the UK. However, there are a lot more parties in Israel than in the UK, as you can see from my chart here. And so basically there are 120 seats in Israel's parliament, in the Knesset. There's only one house of parliament that's elected, in theory, every 4 years, but it ends up being much more often. And because there's so many parties, no one party has a coalition or has a majority, and after an election they have to form a coalition. So when it's election day and you go to the ballot booth and you vote, you don't have a regional representative that you vote for the way it is here in the UK. It's you just choose a party, and that party has a list, and depending on proportionate to the percentage of the votes, how many seats they get in the Knesset, then this, the first 20 people on that list, or the first 13 people on that list. And that list is publicized in advance, so you know sort of who you could be getting. So that's just the basics of how these people got into the Knesset. And there's differences between the individual parties that I'll tell you about. And the way the coalition is formed is essentially shared interests, that a number of parties, usually the head of the largest party, although not always, usually the head of the largest party forms the coalition, and they find other parties who are willing to work with them on some sort of joint policy, and they of course appoint people to different ministries, and that's also a way to convince people to join the coalition. And that's how the prime minister forms a majority and is able to govern. So that's your sort of crash course in Israeli civics before I get into the parties, which are the more interesting parts. So I'm going to talk about the parties and I'm going to put them on a scale to some extent of right to left. And it's important to know in Israel that when you talk about right and left, the issue is basically the Palestinians, or peace is really, how Israelis think we could come to some sort of final settlement agreement with the Palestinians. What should the arrangement be? So further to the right are fewer concessions, and further to the left are more concessions, and by concessions it's generally concessions of land. And that's when in Israel you talk about right and left, that's what they're talking about. So it's not necessarily social issues or economic issues, and even though in some ways the Israeli right and left tracks with what those things mean here in the UK or in Europe in general, it's not necessarily. And I heard a few American accents in the room. It's very different from America. The baseline is, much in the way that Europe is different from America, where the baseline for right and left is to the left, basically, of the American baseline. So just so you understand the scale that I'm placing people on. Now, I'm going to go through the different parties, and you'll see that some of these parties are based on a political idea on right and left, and some of these represent populations in Israel. But I'll try to sort of characterize the voters in the different parties, and obviously there are generalizations, but I hope it'll give you insight into the population of the very diverse population of Israel. So I'm going to start with the coalition, and then we'll move on to the opposition. So the biggest party in the coalition is the Likud, led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, someone who I'm sure all of you have heard of, as opposed to most of the other pictures on the screen, if not all of them, which these are people that have less of an international profile. Netanyahu's party is considered a center-right party. By no means they are considered a left-wing party. They're a center-right party, but they have an interesting sort of issue when it comes to the big question of how to make peace, or what the solution should be to the conflict. Because Netanyahu says that he wants a two-state solution, and that means he wants there to be a demilitarized Palestinian state. That's his idea, and that Israel should continue to have a security presence in the Jordan Valley. But if he were to bring that to a vote in his party, he would probably lose. Most people in the Likud, or most of the members of Knesset in the Likud, don't want a Palestinian state. They say so openly. And so the Likud actually has not had an official party platform in many years. If you go on their website, you're not going to find an updated party platform. And it's because Netanyahu and his party are to some extent at odds. On the other hand, he's extremely popular in his party, and he doesn't really have any challengers. It's a question people often ask me. There are people who see themselves as heirs to Netanyahu, but not someone in the party who would openly challenge him at the moment. Now, if we talk about who votes for the Likud, now they're a major party, so they do pull in people from all different populations in Israel. But there is a story behind the Likud's ascendance in Israel that says a lot about sort of Israel's history and different people in Israeli society. So Israel was founded in 1948, and until 1977, the predecessors of it's Zionist Union, but they're better known as the Labor Party. So the predecessors were called Mapai or Marach, Marach or the Alignment in English. They ran the governments in Israel until 1977. In 1977, Israel had its first right-wing prime minister, Menachem Begin, who was the head of the Likud. Now, part of the support for Menachem Begin came from Sephardic people in Israel, Jews of Middle Eastern and North African descent. Not only, again, they're a major party in the country, so they have support from all over, but this is sort of an interesting engine and catalyst for the Likud's rise, because the first 29 years of Israel's existence, the sort of establishment of the people who ran the country were Eastern European Jews. And they had a very socialist-leaning system, but despite calling themselves socialist, it was in many ways a very elitist system. And if you weren't a member of their party, it was harder to get prominent jobs. It was harder to really go up the ranks. And some of these people who were coming from the Middle East and North African countries were educated people. Some weren't. Some came from sort of villages where they were not familiar with the more modern technology or the more modern system that was in Israel. But certainly plenty of them could have had flourishing and good careers and contributed to Israeli society, but it was difficult. There was actually in the early years of Israel racism against essentially the non-white Jews. And there, in the 1970s, there began to be sort of rumblings against this in Israel, and they decided to support Menachem Begin. Now, what's interesting about Begin is that he was an old Ashkenazi male. He wasn't one of them. But they saw his support for a freer, more open market, and they saw his, I talk about sort of individual rights as things that can help them rise societally, to help them find a more equal place in Israeli society. And I think to some extent it really happened. There's certainly a huge change. I wasn't around then, but what they say is that there's a huge change, and certainly people who are my age don't really see a difference between, if your grandparents were from Algeria or from Poland. So that was a huge engine in Likud's rise, and to this day, when you speak to people, some of their Knesset members, certainly those who are middle-aged or older, they talk about their parents connecting to Likud and supporting Likud because they felt like it was their way to really move forward in Israeli society and find an equal place. So these are stories about Israel that maybe you don't always hear, and stories about the Likud. I think internationally, Netanyahu gets this name, and the Likud get this name as like their, the warmongers or the neocons of the Knesset, and there's a lot more to them, I think, that people don't know. I also think the warmonger label is wrong, because Netanyahu is very much the opposite of that. He's a very status quo figure, and he won't shoot anything unless he's pushed into it. But they seem very much like the establishment today in 2017 because Netanyahu has been prime minister for so long. But this is like the base. This is some of their strongest supporters come from this tradition. So after Likud, we have a party called Kulanu. I don't have a good historical story for you about them because they're a new party that ran for the first time in the last election. They're led by someone named Moshe Kachlon. Actually, if we're talking about the whole history of Likud and the Sephardi Jews in Israel, so his family was originally from Libya, and he also was in a very poor family, and they were loyal Likud voters. So he was a Likud minister, and he was most famous and most popular when he was communications minister. He became the most popular politician in Israel. The polls showed he was extremely popular because he opened up the cell phone market. So there were only 3 companies that you could get your cell phone service from, not like Apple or Samsung, but O2 or things like that. And he opened up the market, so there were many more companies, and Israel had the cheapest cell phone service in the world after that. So that made him extremely popular. He was saving every Israeli hundreds of shekels a month. It sounds like a silly thing, but you're people directly felt that. So he became very popular. But then he started to feel that Netanyahu was resenting that popularity and putting obstacles in front of him to succeed politically. That's his perspective on it, at least. So he took a break from politics for a few years and came back and founded his own party that's based on economic issues and the cost of living, lowering the cost of living and also the cost of housing, which is a huge issue in Israel. In 2011, thousands of Israelis took to the streets and pitched tents in parks to protest that the rent is too high and that housing is too high in Israel. So this was partially a response, this new party is partially a response to that. It's also probably the reason that you don't hear about them outside of Israel, because I think that the international press doesn't care that much about Israel's domestic issues. But this is a big one. When people vote, security is the number one issue, but cost of housing in recent years has been the number two. So he has this is a new party, so the first time they ran 10 seats is not bad for the first time, and he's our finance minister now. So in theory, he's working on lowering the cost of housing yet. I still can't afford a house, so I don't know what to tell you about his success so far, but